Good morning. I am John OLoughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And this morning I'm doing a continuation of a show I did, number 105, I think it was, on about the fall of Albert Pike. And we saw his statue come down, get pulled down by some of the protesters this past summer after a lot of fruitless efforts to bring it down before, especially efforts made by Anton Chaikin, one of the principal writers at LaRouche organization. And so I have been, going through the Executive Intelligence Review, culling articles that help me understand what is the background of our FBI. Why the FBI? Because that's where my father worked for, I think, 11 to 12 years. And his personal relationship with J. Edgar Hoover kind of makes the FBI something I would like to respect. I'd like to have the idea that fidelity, bravery, integrity really is the ideal of the FBI special agents, all the way up to Hoover himself. With respect to that question, I've also run into a lot of evidence, and going to Hoover himself, probably, that there were some very racist people in the FBI, and such as the supervisor of the Chicago, William Sullivan, and I believe he's the one that wrote that threatening letter to Martin Luther King Jr., telling him, to stop what he's doing or else. And was the FBI involved in the murder of Martin Luther King Jr.? I don't know. I haven't studied it. It's an obscure and difficult thing to weave into, like everything else in recent history. There's all kinds of stuff written, but how do you know which is true? I do believe the outcome of the civil case filed by Martin Luther King Jr.'s family that showed that James Earl Ray was not the assassin, that it was somebody else. Well, let's go on to the article I wish to read this morning. And this is not really so much my Mindfields this morning as sharing the work of Anton Chaikin, who is still working and alive. I have not spoken to him myself, but I put out feelers through Harley Schlanger that I would love to interview Anton Chaikin. Well, how does Albert Pike, who we talked about 2 days ago or 3 days ago, how does he fit into the history and creation of the FBI? That's the topic of this article this morning, published in the March 20th, 1998 issue of Executive Intelligence Review, entitled "How the KKK Got into the U.S. Justice Department" by Anton Chaikin. April 4th, 1998 marks an extraordinary double anniversary, one that highlights the still ongoing struggle between two irreconcilable traditions in American life. One is a tradition of the American ideal at its best, the tradition of the Lincoln Revolution, as it was carried forward into the 20th century by America's greatest civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The other tradition is that of the British-sponsored anti-American treason, personified by the Confederate General, Southern Jurisdiction Scottish Rite Mason, and Ku Klux Klan founder Albert Pike. The Pike legacy still exists today under various guises. The FBI of the J. Edgar Hoover tradition, which is engaged in a racist campaign of frame-ups against African-American elected officials all across America, and the radical Jacobinism of Black nationalism, which came to the fore as the result of Dr. King's assassination, and which parades today under the banner of a, quote, rainbow coalition, unquote. You remember the use of that rainbow coalition by by Jesse, um, Jesse from Chicago. Oh God, I've forgotten this. Jesse Jackson, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who, coincidentally was on the balcony with Dr. King. And well, we have our suspicions about Reverend Jackson. Nobody can fully appreciate the still unfolding struggle over the American ideal without knowing the essentials of the struggle between the two contending forces represented by Martin Luther King Jr. and Albert Pike. And this is written in 1998, just so we bear that in mind. This is before 9/11 and before all of the things that have dominated our news since then. But it's a good thing that it's written back then, because it's uncluttered by all of that as well. King and the Lincoln tradition. President Abraham Lincoln's policies were responsible for making the United States into the world's greatest industrial power. He reversed the free trade doctrines by which the London allied opponents of the American Revolution had expanded slavery. He introduced high tariffs to foster steel mills, government financing of railroad construction, free land, and education to create independent scientific farmers. Martin Luther King was firmly rooted in this tradition. He pointed out, for example, how the advance of human rights depends on technological and economic progress. Many of the problems that we are confronting in the South today grow out of the futile attempt of the white South to maintain a system of human values that came into being under a feudalistic plantation system and which cannot survive in a day of democratic egalitarianism. First, if the South is to grow economically, it must continue to industrialize. We see, and then in the early 1960s, we see signs of this vigorous industrialization with a concomitant urbanization throughout every southern state. Day after day, the South is receiving new multi-million-dollar industries. With the growth of industry, the folk ways of white supremacy will gradually pass away. The growth of industry will also increase the purchasing power of the Negro. And by the way, this is Dr. King's words, not Anton Chaikin's. And this augmented purchasing power will result in improved medical care, greater educational opportunities, and more adequate housing. Each of these developments will result in a further weakening of segregation, unquote. So what Chaikin is quoting Martin Luther King Jr. for the proposition that Dr. King was in favor of production, of industrial production as a means of lifting the standard of living and increasing the purchasing power, increasing the access to education, and breaking down the walls of segregation. This, I think, we need to consider, and this is my opinion, as an alternate vision to the give me culture of what we're seeing right now with these $1 trillion appropriations by Congress of money that doesn't exist yet, in order to supplement the income of people without actually addressing the problem of our lack of industry to underlie the economy and make it work, as Dr. King's words have just said. Pardon me a second. King taught that this progress does not occur automatically, but only with the strongest economic intervention of representative government. He demanded that the nationalist, activist government strategy which made America powerful now be applied to lifting Blacks out of poverty. Pike, creation of the indigenous, unquote, KKK. Patriotic nationalists continued Lincoln's economic program after the president's 1865 murder. Post-Civil War Reconstruction regimes in several southern states, led by freed black slaves and allied whites, began to put through measures of industrial and agricultural development. But the British and their allies in the former Confederacy struck back, using London's modus operandi of creating, quote, indigenous, unquote, insurgencies to wield against their political enemies. This was the technique that Lord Palmerston perfected in the mid-19th century. He deployed a veritable zoo of national, religious, and ethnic insurgencies through agents such as Giuseppe Mazzini, the better to retain British global geopolitical control. And another note from myself here, that has been the theme that we've learned from Webster Tarpley and from all the work at LaRouche organization, to see that something like these crazy collaborationist militia armies that claim to believe in blood and soil, for instance, which we cope with now, are most likely more of these characters from Palmerston's zoo modernized into the 21st century, and not real indigenous movements. How many of these crazy movements that we face in the United States, from Pat Robertson's evangelism to the white supremacy people to the KKK and the revival of the Old South, how much of that is really operations driven by MI6, by the City of London and the successors to Lord Palmerston, who created this system back in the 19th century? After Lincoln's death, a covert movement known as the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, began in 1867 in Tennessee, overturned the Reconstruction regimes with violence and riots, assassinating those loyal to the United States, torturing and killing Black people who asserted rights which Black and white Union soldiers had secured in the Civil War. Many years later, when the criminals were no longer in danger of punishment for their crimes, some inside stories of the post-Civil War KKK were published, glorifying the Klan in order to recreate it in the 20th century. Pardon me. A few years later, after a United States national monument had been erected in Albert Pike's honor, the leading pro-KKK historian, Walter Fleming, disclosed and praised the kingpin role that Pike had played in the Klan's terror spree against U.S. law. An academic darling of the Eastern Anglophile elite, Fleming was considered the preeminent historian of Southern Reconstruction. Pike was the KKK's, quote, chief judicial officer. Fleming wrote, Pike thus ruled officially over the Klan's internal disciplinary or counterintelligence department. In the KKK birth state of Tennessee, Pike was the president of the Bar Association and publisher of the main racist newspaper. But it was as sovereign grand commander of the Scottish Rite, the recognized boss of the Southern White Freemasonic Order, that Pike exercised the great clandestine power that welded the KKK together. Fleming cites Pike's Masonic colleagues and Klan co-founders as the main sources for his KKK history. Pike's successor as Scottish Rite Masonic Grand Commander, Congressman James Richardson, introduced the 1898 House resolution authorizing the Pike statue. Richardson had been Speaker of the Tennessee House of Representatives in the heyday of the Ku Klux Klan power in that state. In defense of the Klan insurrection, Fleming writes, The ex-Confederates naturally formed secret associations for self-defense, unquote. Fleming then furnishes European precedents for Pike's KKK, the Carbonari of Italy, the Tugendbund of Germany, the Kleps of Greece, Young Italy, the Nihilists of Russia, the Masonic Order in most Catholic countries, Beati Paoli of Sicily, the Illuminati, etc. Such groups are textbook cases of the British colonial and Secret Service tradition of manipulating, quote, indigenous, unquote, people. A Massachusetts Tory, Pike went south to incite whites against the Union. He helped lead the Knights of the Golden Circle, which made armed filibuster attacks against Mexico and Cuba and organized the Southern Secession. As a Confederate general during the Civil War, Pike was in charge of enticing American Indians to war on the United States. His atrocities and war crimes led to his arrest by the embarrassed Confederates and an 1865 indictment by the United States for treason. Pike fled to Canada, remaining there under the protection of his British Empire sponsors until the heat was off. When Pike returned to the South, the old Knights of the Golden Circle logo was transmuted into the Knights of the KKK, the title taken from the Greek kuklos, or circle. Pike's Arkansas indictment for war crimes against American soldiers was swept aside by the power of Pike's own clandestine terrorist movement over the Southern justice system. Well known in European occult circles for his satanic writings, a Sybarite of massive girth, Pike died in 1891. A resume of this quality today would surely qualify KKK founder Pike as a leader of contemporaneous movements, such as the Chiapas, quote, indigenous rebellion, unquote, against Mexico's nationhood. Interesting comment about a rebellion that I had forgotten about in the 90s in Chiapas in Mexico. U.S. Representative James Richardson, the Masonic Grand Commander, introduced House Resolution 178 on March 10, 1898, to permit his Scottish right to erect on federal property a huge memorial statue honoring Albert Pike, a mass murderer who had worked for several decades to overthrow America's laws and government. This outrageous initiative was timed to coincide with a racist war frenzy that was being pushed by the faction promoting the Pike statue. 23 days earlier, on February 15, 1898, the U.S. battleship Maine had been blown up in the harbor of Havana, killing 260 men. This mysterious explosion has never been explained, but lurid headlines blamed the government of Spain, which still held Cuba as a colony. At this time, the Boston Tory, Wall Street banker, Southern Klan faction advocated Anglo-Saxon racial solidarity with Imperial Britain, in line with Cecil Rhodes and the British Round Table's demand that America give up its silly revolution. This Anglophile faction was co-sponsoring with the British Secret Service an anti-Spain insurgency in Cuba. Since the 1840s, the transatlantic anti-republican faction had procured wars and mercenary filibuster raids into Mexico, Central America, and Cuba, aimed at expanding the slave territory and consolidating a Southern secession movement. During the 1890s, these Anglophile traders created and operated a new Cuban, quote, revolutionary movement in the tradition of Pike's Knights of the Golden Circle. The nominal leader, Jose Marti, resided in New York City and was an activist in the insurrectionist networks of Lord Palmerston's Masonic-trained dog, Giuseppe Mazzini. The sponsoring clique in the United States included Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, descendant and political heir of the Tory anti-union intriguer George Cabot, and Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt. His beloved uncle and naval strategy advisor, James Dunwoody Bullock, had been arrested as a Masonic filibusterer in Havana Harbor back in 1854. Bullock advised Teddy from London, where Bullock was in exile for having arranged Britain's building of a pirate fleet of Confederate ships to attack U.S. commerce during the Civil War. And the Scottish Rite Masons and kindred Masonic and British Secret Service cults. This Anglophile clique demanded that their pet Cuban revolutionaries be supported by U.S. troops in expelling Spain from Cuba. The object was neither an independent Cuban nation nor expansion of the United States to include Cubans as American citizens. Rather, the Caribbean was to be subject to imperial power of the London-New York banking axis, and to be a permanent adventurer's staging ground for subversion against the entire Western Hemisphere. American patriots had always fought against these schemes. Abraham Lincoln had opposed the 1846-48 U.S.-Mexican War, and as president had aligned the United States with Mexico against the British-French invasion of 1861. Lincoln's nationalist successors, such as James Garfield and William McKinley, were allied with Ibero-American nationalists and economic protectionists against British free trade and British-backed irregular warfare. So if you're just picking up on some of this jargon, the idea of free trade sounds so good, but free trade is really in enhancement of slavery. Because if you have free trade with no tariffs, then if the British can import cotton from the American South without paying any tariff on it, then they are able to exploit, slave labor. That's called free trade. But what it really is exploitation of minimum or sub-living wage or slavery, as we abhor so much in this century when we think of the sweatshops and places in China, sweatshops in the garment district in the past and maybe even now. But that idea of exploiting labor is right beneath the surface of free trade and undercutting American labor by supplying the labor either for free or very cheaply in a foreign country with no tariff barriers. On February 15, 1898, the battleship Maine blew up. On February 25th, President McKinley's Navy Secretary John Long took the afternoon off. A fatal mistake. Senator Lodge, remember Henry Cabot Lodge is the star of The Unguarded Gate, the book I read by Daniel OLoughlin, which explains the imposition of immigration quotas based upon the racism of the British and American upper class, the so-called Boston Brahmins, of which Henry Cabot Lodge and his son, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., became the ambassador to South Vietnam and was running the Phoenix program with Ed Lansdale and the other spooks without the knowledge of the American people. These are the elites, and this is their method of control. So John D. Long takes the afternoon off. Senator Lodge came to the Navy Department to work with Teddy Roosevelt, the Assistant Secretary of Navy, who was acting secretary for the remaining 3 or 4 hours of the day. Using Roosevelt's temporary authority, the pair put the U.S. Navy on a war footing, sending telegrams and cables to all ships at sea, to consuls, to Navy yards and factories. They ordered ammunition, called on Congress to authorize sailors' enlistment, and ordered the European, South Atlantic, and Pacific squadrons to prepare for battle positioning. The cable to clique member Admiral George Dewey ordered the redeployment of his Pacific battle fleet to prevent Spain's ships from leaving the Asian coast to defend the Spanish-owned Philippine Islands, was the final act, making war with Spain a virtual certainty. So that's Teddy Roosevelt, the nephew of James Bullock. James Bullock, who works with the British Secret Service and the British shipyards to produce such ships as the Alabama, the Commerce Raiders. And to whose benefit did that flow? Well, it definitely hurt the American war effort in that it destroyed the American commercial fleet. But what it really did was to benefit the British fleet, which, of course, is the object of the whole Civil War, is to diminish the economic power of America in favor of Britain. So the British fleet now takes over the commercial shipping of the world once the Americans have been wiped out by Southern commerce raiders actually working under a Confederate flag, but working in essence for the British. And that's the sadness about that we have to admit. I grew up in a time when kids, could play, I'm a Confederate, I'm a Yankee. And I could see, and I can still see, the appeal of the Confederate, states' rights and all of that. That's not what this was about, though. This was not about being true to your state or to your ancestors or to honor or any of that. What this really was a British operation to tear apart the United States, to enable this golden circle of slavery all the way around the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. And so they could exploit the labor under the name free trade to the benefit not of the British people either, but simply of the owners of the textile mills and the banks in Britain. That is the real history that is being revealed by people like Anton Chaikin in this writing. On March 10th, 1898, while the country was gripped with Anglo-Saxon war fever. What? Anglo-Saxon war fever? Because we are the Anglo-Saxons now. We identify with Britain now. We're no longer, these Republican Americans that fought to be free of Britain. Now we're now putting our Anglo-Saxon nature front and foremost. It was subsequently, while the country was gripped by Anglo-Saxon war fever, the Pike Statute Resolution was introduced in the House of Representatives. It was subsequently introduced in the Senate by Henry Teller of Colorado, a member of the Supreme Council of Pike's Scottish Rite of Freemasonry Southern jurisdiction. On March 31st, 1898, Teddy Roosevelt wrote to British strategist James Bryce, exulting in his actions to reunify America with the British Empire. Quote, "It will give me great pleasure to meet Mr. George Macaulay Trevelyan, not only because he is a friend of yours, but because of my admiration for his father, Sir George Trevelyan, former British Admiralty Secretary. And I shall like much to meet the Webbs, the Fabian Society socialist leaders. I have had a very busy time, but anxious only in the sense that I fear this nation will not do its duty. We should drive Spain from the Western world. I cordially sympathize with England's attitude in China, and I am glad to say that there seems to be a gradual coming together of the two peoples, Britain and America. They certainly ought to come together," unquote. Teddy Roosevelt. On April 4th, 1898, the Pike Statute was authorized by the House and the next day by the Senate. On April 11th, 1898, President McKinley, who was resisting the intriguers' pressure to make war, asked Congress for authority to intervene in Cuba to establish peace between the government and the rebels. Quote, "It involves hostile constraint upon both parties to the contest, as well to enforce a truce as to guide the eventual settlement, said the president. The Scottish Rite's Senator Teller was a longtime partisan for the Cuban insurrection. Teller now introduced an amendment smoothing away remaining Senate opposition to the war. It declared that the United States disclaimed any intention to exercise jurisdiction or control over the island except for the pacification thereof. Teddy Roosevelt went to his Cuban War as a volunteer officer, and his newspaper friends puffed up his exploits into heroism. He was made the vice presidential running mate in McKinley's re-election bid in 1900. They were inaugurated in March 1901. 6 months later, McKinley was shot, just as his nationalist predecessors Lincoln and Garfield had been. McKinley died on September 14, 1901, and Theodore Roosevelt assumed the presidency. This was a huge victory for the British in their bid to regain control over the United States. Its impact is still being felt in America today. Teddy Roosevelt's takeover occurred just in time for completion of the Albert Pike Memorial Statue, dedicated on October 24, 1901. 2 days later, the Scottish Rite's Supreme Council were received in a body by the bullet-installed President Roosevelt, an ardent fellow Mason. They went from the White House to the grave of Albert Pike for a celebration. Pardon me. Now, here we go with what I wanted to get to here today, the real story of the FBI. President Teddy Roosevelt set to work immediately to reverse Lincoln's nationalist policies. He created the Federal Bureau of Investigation as a coercive instrument for that purpose, as we shall document below. Under Roosevelt, the nation was told that the Western frontier was closed, that, quote, conservation, unquote, rather than agro-industrial development was the future. Government land was withdrawn from public use. Steps were taken to overturn Lincoln's programs to create family farms, railroads, and mines. British-backed financier Edward H. Harriman illegally used vast land grants for speculation with Roosevelt's blessing, then paid for Roosevelt's election in 1904. British-run financier J.P. Morgan seized control over the great industries, steel, electricity, railroads, that had been created by Lincoln's nationalists. Morgan's trusts were undisturbed by Teddy Roosevelt despite his false trust buster reputation, and TR flouted U.S. laws calling for cooperation with Ibero-American nations, using Morgan's and Harriman's employees and agents for a proxy war that broke off the province of Panama from Colombia to build a canal on terms pitting the United States against its southern neighbors. Key to the creation of the FBI as a KKK police state apparatus was an operation to destroy Oregon Senator John H. Mitchell, an old Lincoln Republican, who led congressional opposition to all Roosevelt's outrages, speaking out against the international banking syndicate running TR's policy. But Roosevelt got the U.S. attorney in Oregon indicted, and his new special prosecutor, Francis Heaney, aided by private detective William J. Burns and members of the Secret Service, were used to falsely prosecute Senator Mitchell and scores of Mitchell's political allies. A later government investigation disclosed the methods used to force witnesses to give false testimony and to pack juries with Mitchell's enemies in this politically motivated prosecution. Sounds like Roger Stone, doesn't it? These are among the reports to Roosevelt's agents on prospective jurors. Quote, convictor from the word go, unquote. Socialist, anti-Mitchell. Quote, would convict Christ. Quote, he is apt to wish Mitchell hung, unquote. Mitchell was convicted of the crime of his law firm having accepted $1,700 fees in aiding citizens to press claims to public land. He was defamed in the press. Congress understood itself now subject to Roosevelt's detectives, who were to, quote, spy into the private lives of members and to collect information to be held as a political club, unquote. Mitchell found himself without defenders. He was politically destroyed and died before he could appeal. With such opposition out of the way, the time was now ripe for the creation of a permanent national secret police. On December 17, 1906, Teddy Roosevelt shifted his Navy Secretary, Charles J. Bonaparte, to become Attorney General. Bonaparte told Congress that the Department of Justice must be given, quote, a force of permanent police under its control, unquote. On May 27, 1908, Congress reacted by prohibiting all executive departments from using Secret Service agents as policemen. Then, on July 26, 1908, Attorney General Bonaparte, on Teddy Roosevelt's instructions, ordered the creation of an investigative agency within the Department of Justice. This later became known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So you see the dynamics there was that Roosevelt used the Secret Service to spy on Congress. Now Congress says, no, we're passing a law that says you can't use any federal agency to spy on Congress. Okay, so that's why they needed a Department of Justice police force to spy on Congress. At issue here was the fundamental question: shall men be ruled by an unelected oligarchy, or shall self-government order society in conformance with the dignity of every human being as in the image of God? Charles Bonaparte was the grandson of Napoleon Bonaparte's brother Jerome, the King of Westphalia. How ironic, huh? The people that are trying to break apart the Peace of Westphalia come from the King of Westphalia, Jerome Bonaparte, the young brother who married the American. And, well, I think the story is going to be told here. Napoleon had dissolved his brother's marriage, and Charles's Baltimore grandmother had spent the rest of her life desperately asserting the claim that Charles's father was of royal blood. Charles inherited the family's royal jewels, and before Roosevelt brought him into the government, he used to ride each day to his investment house behind a liveried Negro groom carrying a solid silver lunchbox. His brother, Jerome Napoleon Bonaparte, was an officer on the staff of Emperor Napoleon III throughout the British-French invasion of Mexico and their joint support of the Confederate rebellion. Charles was immersed in the society of Anglophiles and their London betters in the belief that American white rabble, immigrants, and Negroes had usurped control rightfully belonging to the aristocracy. Teddy Roosevelt and Charles Bonaparte had united as activists in the civil service reform during the 1880s, instigated by Lord James Bryce. This was the London, Boston, Wall Street Confederate Axis, promoting a, quote, clean, permanent bureaucracy chosen by the bankers and their news media to administer government instead of the, quote, corrupt constitutional system of elected officials and their appointed men. What Lord Bryce and his American followers most objected to were the urban political machines whose leaders fulfilled the needs of their voting constituencies. Irish, German, and other immigrants who carried with them hostility to the British Empire and the demand for a better life, and freed blacks who were still determined to avail themselves of Lincoln's reopening of the American Revolution. Charles Bonaparte despised the spirit of the Constitution. He commented on due process of law, quote, need anybody cry if an officer's revolver does now and then save our courts the trouble of trying a burglar and cut off his chance of burgling again when released or escapes from prison? On the subject of hanging of Negroes by mobs, he said, quote, "I believe that very few innocent men are lynched, and of those who have not committed the past offense for which they suffer, a still smaller proportion are decent members of society. It is, of course, an evil that the law should be occasionally enforced by lawless means, but it is, in my opinion, a great evil that it should be habitually duped and evaded by means formally lawful," unquote. In other words, there's no room in the world for defense attorneys or legal rights or the Bill of Rights or any of that. It's all really just a question of what does the aristocracy want to do. Albert Pike's day had indeed come. A permanent anti-constitutional bureaucracy and spy system had been established. This arrangement was sustained by the financier oligarchy, as witnessed the editorials of the New York Times, a newspaper which J.P. Morgan had recently moved under the ownership of what became the Aulks-Sulzberger-Warburg family combination. Under the headline, "The Negro Question," the Times editorialized on May the 1st, 1899, on why lynching and the new laws ending blacks' right to vote were not so bad. And I will skip the quotation, but you can understand that this is the New York Times setting the tone, saying, hey, lynching, maybe against the law, but not so bad. Well, when we now look back behind the New York Times to J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan being financed and being an agent of the London financial empire, that becomes clear that the introduction of Jim Crow, the separate but equal Plessy versus Ferguson decision of the 1890s, the idea that the races are distinct and must be kept distinct is not an American idea. It is a British idea. The melting pot is the American idea. The segregation is the British idea. And segregation is not just racial, it's also class. It's also, we are the aristocrats. We went to Oxford, we went to Harvard, we went to Yale. And if you're not among them, then you kind of become a pawn in their game. And I think that's basically what happens with people. As Lord Bertrand Russell said, if somebody appears to be smart and worth bringing into the upper class, I don't think that was his word, but bringing into their society, and then it turns out that he still has sympathies for the folks back home, for the average Joe, then we're going to have to get rid of him, because that's dangerous. He might start a revolution. And that's, I think, Macduff's story in a nutshell. That they brought him in, they realized that he still had a conscience, and so they said, we got to get rid of this guy. No matter how smart he is, no matter how competent he is, no matter how well he serves us, if he still has a conscience, he can't be allowed to exist any longer, because he knows too much. Under President Teddy Roosevelt, a force similar to that post-Civil War KKK began to operate within the federal government itself, though the Klan itself had died out. In 1915, President Woodrow Wilson launched the creation of a new Ku Klux Klan by praising and showing in the White House the pro-Klan movie Birth of a Nation. Spreading from south to north with the mass circulation of the film the president had endorsed, the new KKK would grow to many millions of members. Meanwhile, also in 1915, the Scottish Southern Rite Masons dedicated their new House of the Temple in Washington, D.C. Having moved their headquarters from South Carolina to the nation's capital, they now celebrated their successful installation within the government they had fought to overthrow. In later years, the body of Albert Pike would be interred inside one of the temple's walls. A few feet away, they built a complete replication of the office and desk of their second most honored member, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. So today, visitors to the temple may conveniently pay homage to the twin giants of Klan and Scottish Rite history, Pike and Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover's War Against King. Given Hoover's link to the Pike tradition, it is no surprise to discover that during the 1960s, Hoover's FBI ran a guerrilla war against Martin Luther King. FBI agents and paid traitors swarmed around King, assigned to find or manufacture dirt that could bring him down. With constant wiretapping, Hoover fed leaks, lies, and gossip to the news media. The FBI coordinated this onslaught with the Klan faction in Southern police departments and the pro-Hoover anti-Black faction, the Anti-Defamation League, within the Jewish community. Now, that's an assertion by Anton Chaikin. I don't know that to be true, but this is important to think about. Is the ADL, which has in other places been asserted by writers at LaRouche Organization to be a front for British intelligence. And that, of course, makes sense the way they would always layer themselves behind other organizations. Well, is the ADL anti-Black? I don't know. That's what Chaikin says, so let's move on. Hoover attacked with three main allegations: financial irregularities, communism, and sexual misconduct. The financial angle was ineffective and failed. The communist smear revolved around associates of King who were said to be communists, while Hoover knew quite well that King was no communist. The FBI slander has been kept for retailing by King's opponents, who neither know nor particularly care what King stood for. King wrote on the subject, "In communism, the individual ends up in subjection to the state." How many people know that Martin Luther King was not a socialist or a communist? That he says right here, in communism, the individual ends up in subjection to the state. Man becomes hardly more in communism than a depersonalized cog in the turning wheel of the state. The popularity of communism lay in the idealistic concern for social justice. This is Martin Luther King 50, 60 years ago, right? Now, what do we talk about? It's social justice. Though the world knows from sad experience that in practice it created new classes and a new lexicon of injustice. Communism and Christianity are fundamentally incompatible. A true Christian cannot be a true communist, for the two philosophies are antithetical, and all the dialectics of the logicians cannot reconcile them, unquote. Hoover fanatically pursued details of King's sex life. Government officials who knew about this considered Hoover to be pornographically obsessed. As posthumous revelations about gay Edgar showed, their estimations were conservative. This vendetta climaxed in the production of an audio tape which was mailed to King's home, combining presumed buggings with the suggestion that King should commit suicide. King's murder in 1968 was followed by a relentless FBI cover-up. James Earl Ray was intimidated into making a guilty plea on the threat of certain death penalty were he to demand a trial. He immediately protested the setup, but was not allowed to change his false plea. Martin Luther King's family is pressing Ray's case to overturn the cover-up, but as of this writing, the imprisoned Ray is dying of liver failure, while the Justice Department attempts to stop a trial from finally taking place before Ray dies. Well, the good news is that the family did win the trial, and so from the point of view of the law, that James Earl Ray has been proven innocent. So who did it? Well, we may never know. One of J. Edgar Hoover's claims against King was that Black Power demagogues were taking over King's movement. In fact, the opposition to King was backed by the FBI itself and by high-ranking members of the Anglophile establishment. The FBI-backed opposition came in all shapes and colors. H. Rap Brown declared in 1967, quote, "The white man is your enemy. You got to destroy your enemy. I say you better get a gun. Violence is necessary. It is as American as cherry pie," unquote. King denounced such agentry. Quote, "I've often talked with the proponents of Black Power who argue passionately about the validity of violence and riots. Their Bible is Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. In violent warfare, one must be prepared to face the fact that there will be casualties by the thousands. Anyone leading a violent rebellion must be willing to make an honest assessment regarding the possible casualties to a minority population. Confronting a well-armed, wealthy majority with a fanatical right wing that would delight in exterminating thousands of Black men, women, and children," unquote. The last section of this is called The Role of the Nashville Agrarians. A new concept to me, but one I think it's important to bring into our discussion. The reader may be surprised at our assertion that Black nationalists were deployed against Martin Luther King and his movement by the same historical faction that erected the statue to KKK founder Albert Pike. But that is the core of the British method of strategic manipulation against the nation state. In America, we can see the traces of this manipulation in the fact that the Klan, in its early years, quote, "had some Negro members," unquote. Researcher Stanley Ezrall has written in an unpublished report, quote, "One of the claims made by the KKK and their apologists is that they had no quarrel with Negroes who stuck to their own kind and stayed in their place, but that they had to defend against the scalawags, carpetbaggers, and the Negroes whom they incited. A frequent claim is that Negroes of the better type even joined the Klan," unquote. Using Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, and Peabody, that is J.P. Morgan, money, Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, hired Fleming as historian in 1917 and made him dean in 1923. Under Fleming's tutelage, a political literary movement called the Fugitives grew up at Vanderbilt. The new movement aimed to revive the Confederacy and the Old South, but its financier sponsors applied these degraded precepts to the more general object of shaping a managed leftism. The Fugitives became known as the Nashville Agrarians after they published a manifesto in a book of essays called "I'll Take My Stand," dedicated to Professor Fleming and committed to, quote, "support a Southern way of life against the American or prevailing way." Agrarian versus industrial. Nashville agrarian John Crow Ransom, a Rhodes Scholar, whose great-uncle James R. Crow was Pike's Masonic and KKK lieutenant in the chief source of Fleming's Klan history, wrote in an accompanying essay why he backed the British establishment's aims as regards America. Quote, "England was actually the model employed by the South. England differs from America, most notably in the fact that England did her pioneering in an indefinite number of centuries ago, did it well enough, and has been living pretty tranquilly on her establishment ever since. Their descendants have had the good sense to consider that this establishment was good enough for them. They have elected to live in accordance with the tradition which they inherited, and they have consequently enjoyed a leisure, a security, and an intellectual freedom that were never the portion of pioneers. Progress never defines its ultimate objective, but thrusts its victims at once into an infinite series. Our vast industrial machine is like a Prussianized state, which is organized strictly for war and can never consent to peace. Industrialism is an insidious spirit, full of false promises and generally fatal to establishments. The attitude that needs artificial respiration is the attitude of resistance on the part of the natives to the salesmen of industrialism. It will be fiercest and most effective if industrialism is represented to the Southern people as a foreign invasion of Southern soil. With this KKK philosophy, Nashville agrarians fanned out into New York, Paris, and other centers of leftist and bohemian culture, and into American universities. One of Ransom's collaborators, William Yandell Elliott, was a Harvard-based kingpin in the British takeover of the American foreign policy establishment. Among his proteges were students Henry Kissinger and McGeorge Bundy. With Elliott, they promoted the view that a world government which prevents industrial progress is needed to avoid nuclear annihilation. McGeorge Bundy went on to head the Ford Foundation, a longtime funder of Vanderbilt and the agrarians, and poured its money into support of anarchists such as Mark Rudd's Weathermen, green eco-terrorists, and black cultural nationalist agents, complete with dashikis. Klan robes, after all, would not be appropriate native costumes. Such third worldists, serving as FBI-managed stooges, have nothing in common with the pro-technology policy of developing sector nationalists, who are in accord with the American Revolution and the Lincoln tradition. Well, I see it's 1 minute after 12, and I've just finished the essay. I wanted to make a couple of comments, but basically what I'm saying is if you listen to this essay and perhaps read it yourself or think about it as you go about your day, the main theme is that look what's happening to America now. We're being deindustrialized. Our industry have been taken over to China or wherever you want to say, and by now with these lockdowns, the Great Reset proceeds to diminish the industrial capacity of America, and they will continue to diminish our capacity to do things not only to earn our own livings, but even to feed ourselves. They will reduce us to serfs and slaves. That is the end game. That is what this essay says, and that is what we observe when we see Klaus Schwab and his Great Reset impending its doom upon America. Have a great afternoon. Thanks a lot.